When he threw me out on the street that morning, screaming that I was nothing, I thought my life was over. But at midnight, when he was wheeled into my emergency room covered in blood, I realized fate has a twisted sense of humor. He had kicked me out, but destiny threw him right at my feet. However, the real shock wasn't seeing him there. It was the crumpled piece of paper that fell from his stretcher the moment the police turned their backs. That paper didn't just save me. It was about to send him straight to hell. You won't believe what I did next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and like the video if you believe in justice. My name is Diana. I am 32 years old and I work as an emergency room nurse in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm used to walking the thin line between life and death every single night. I'm used to saving people, to binding their wounds. But that day, my own wound was so deep that even breathing felt like a heavy burden. Everything started just 12 hours ago in that damned house. Mark Ellison. To the outside world, he is a charismatic, successful businessman. But behind closed doors, he is a controlling tyrant blinded by jealousy. For months, our arguments had become unbearable. But that evening, the darkness in his eyes was something entirely different. He exploded just because I was on the phone with a colleague trying to swap my shift. Mark leaned into my face, his breath smelling of rage. "Enough, Diana. I am sick of your lies, your job, everything about you. This is my house. Get out. You have no place here anymore." I froze. "Mark, it is almost midnight. Where am I supposed to go?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. He didn't care. He threw my suitcase into the hallway. "That is not my problem. Just get out of my sight." It is impossible to describe the humiliation I felt in that moment. The man I had given years of my life to was putting me out the door like a bag of trash. With my pride shattered, I packed my things without saying a word. I didn't even cry. At least I wouldn't cry in front of him. My hands were shaking when I got into my car, but I had nowhere to go. I had only one sanctuary left, my job. When I arrived at the hospital, my eyes were swollen, but I put on my mask. I was a professional. Even if my own life was falling apart, I had to save the lives of others. Hours passed. The emergency room was chaotic as always. Car accidents, heart attacks, bar fights. I worked nonstop to distract myself until the radio announcement came through around 4 in the morning. "Attention all units. Hostage situation ended. Suspect is critically injured. Being routed to regional hospital. ETA 2 minutes." The head nurse turned to me. "Diana, prepare trauma room 1. He is coming in with police escort. The situation is serious." I put on my gloves and waited by the door. As the sirens got closer, a strange, indescribable anxiety grew inside me. I felt like something bad was about to happen, but it never crossed my mind that it could be about me. The ambulance doors flew open. Police and paramedics rushed the stretcher inside. Male, mid-30s, chest trauma, and head trauma, unconscious. I ran to the stretcher. I leaned in to wipe the blood from the patient's face and check his airway. And in that moment, the world stopped. The gauze in my hand fell to the floor. That face, that stubble, those eyebrows. It was Mark. The man who had kicked me out of the house only hours ago, the man who said he never wanted to see my face again, was now in my hospital, under my hands. The police officer next to us was giving a report, out of breath. He attacked a woman at a nightclub. When she ran away, he locked himself in a warehouse and went berserk. The shelves inside collapsed on him. A total psychopath. I was in shock. Mark had kicked me out and then gone to a bar to fight with another woman? Just then, I heard a sound from the other side of the stretcher. Mark regained a semi-conscious state. His eyes opened slightly and he saw me. What I saw in his eyes in that moment was not regret, but pure fear. At that exact second, one of the paramedics handed me the jacket they had cut off Mark. "Nurse, these are the suspect's personal effects. Please log them." I took the jacket. The pocket was heavy. My hand instinctively went into the pocket, and my fingers brushed against a hard, cold object and a crumpled piece of paper. When I pulled that paper out and read it, I felt my knees give way. This was not just a bar fight. The secret Mark was hiding was much bigger than I thought, and now it was my turn for revenge. My fingers trembled as I unfolded that crumpled paper under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, and what I read made my blood run cold in a way that no amount of medical training could have prepared me for. It was a handwritten note, the ink smudged with what looked like dried blood, and the words were chilling in their simplicity. Final payment received. LC marked for Friday. Make it look accidental. No traces. Below that were bank account numbers, dates, and a signature that I recognized immediately because I had seen it on our joint credit card statements for months. Mark's signature. I looked up at the stretcher where Mark lay bleeding and unconscious, and suddenly every strange behavior over the past 6 months clicked into place like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The late-night phone calls he would take in the garage, the mysterious cash deposits into accounts I didn't know existed, the way he would fly into a rage whenever I asked about his whereabouts, and most disturbingly, his obsession with a young paralegal named Lena Carter, who worked at the law firm downtown. LC Lena Carter, the woman the police said he had attacked tonight. The police officer was still standing next to the stretcher filling out paperwork, completely unaware that I was holding evidence of an attempted murder plot in my shaking hands. I knew I had seconds to make a decision that would change everything. If I handed this note to the police right now, Mark would go to prison. But there was something in me that wanted more than just his arrest. I wanted him to feel the same powerlessness, the same terror that he had made me feel for so long. I wanted justice, but I wanted it on my terms. I slipped the note into my scrub pocket just as the attending physician, Dr. Harrison, rushed into the trauma bay with his team. "What do we have, Diana?" he asked, already pulling on his gloves and moving toward Mark's stretcher. I forced my voice to remain steady and professional, even though my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Male, approximately 35 years old, blunt force trauma to the chest and head, possible internal bleeding, vitals are unstable but holding for now, I reported, falling back into the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine even as my world spun out of control. Dr. Harrison leaned over Mark and began his examination while I assisted, my hands moving automatically through procedures I had performed thousands of times. But this time was different. This time, every touch felt like I was touching poison. This man had tried to destroy me, had kicked me out of our home, had humiliated me, and now I knew he had been planning to murder someone. Maybe he had already murdered others. How many other notes were there? How deep did this darkness go? As we worked to stabilize Mark, I caught glimpses of the police officers conferring in the corner of the trauma bay, and I strained to hear their conversation over the beeping monitors and rushing medical staff. "The woman he attacked, Lena Carter, she's pretty shaken up, but she's talking," one officer said to his partner. "She says Ellison had been stalking her for weeks, sending threatening messages, showing up at her workplace. Tonight, he cornered her at Murphy's bar and told her she had made a terrible mistake by rejecting him. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her and said something strange." The other officer flipped through his notepad. "Yeah, here it is," he said. "You should have taken the money when I offered it. Now you're going to take the fall instead." What the hell does that mean? What money? What fall? The officers looked at each other, clearly confused, and I felt that note burning like fire in my pocket, because suddenly I understood exactly what Mark had meant. Lena Carter wasn't just some random woman Mark had become obsessed with. She knew something. She had something on him. And Mark had tried to silence her permanently, but when she refused whatever deal he had offered, he had snapped and tried to kill her right there in that warehouse. The note in my pocket wasn't about paying someone to hurt Lena. It was about paying Lena to keep quiet. And when that failed, Mark had taken matters into his own hands. Dr. Harrison's voice cut through my racing thoughts. "Diana, I need you to get a full toxicology panel on this patient. Something about his neurological responses isn't adding up. Also, get security to make sure those police officers don't leave until I can speak with them. This guy's injuries are consistent with the story, but there's something else going on here. He looked at me with those sharp eyes that had taught me so much over the years. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I wanted to tell him that I had seen worse than a ghost. I had seen the true face of evil, and it belonged to the man I had shared a bed with for 2 years. But instead, I just nodded and said, "I'm fine, just a long night." I turned to leave the trauma bay to get the toxicology supplies when I heard Mark groan on the stretcher. His eyes fluttered open again, more alert this time, and they immediately found me across the room. The fear I had seen earlier was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. Recognition, calculation, threat. His lips moved, barely a whisper, but I could read them clearly. "You found it, didn't you?" The heart monitor next to him started beeping faster, his blood pressure spiking with his agitation. Dr. Harrison moved to sedate him, but Mark fought against the restraints, his eyes never leaving mine. "Diana, please, you don't understand. I can explain everything. Just please don't." But Dr. Harrison had already administered the sedative, and Mark's words slurred into nothing as his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. The doctor looked at me with concern. "Do you know this patient, Diana? He seems to know you." The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and I knew that my next words would determine everything that came after. I could tell the truth right now, tell Dr. Harrison that this was my ex-boyfriend, that I had evidence he was planning to commit murder, that I was compromised and shouldn't be treating him. That would be the ethical thing to do. That would be the right thing to do. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out. "I've never seen him before in my life, doctor. Maybe he's delirious from the head trauma." The lie tasted like acid on my tongue, but I swallowed it down because I had made my choice. I wasn't going to let Mark Ellison weasel his way out of this with lawyers and bail and some sob story about how he was the real victim. I was going to make sure he paid for everything, and I was going to do it my way. Dr. Harrison accepted my answer and turned back to his patient, but I saw the police officer in the corner watching me with narrowed eyes, and I knew he had heard the exchange between Mark and me. I had to be careful, very careful. One wrong move and this whole thing could blow up in my face. I left the trauma bay and headed toward the supply room, my mind racing with possibilities and plans. The note in my pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and I knew I couldn't keep it hidden forever. But I also knew that if I played this right, that note could be the key to destroying Mark completely. I was standing in the supply room staring at shelves of medical equipment when I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to find the police officer who had been watching me standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Nurse Brooks, right?" he said, reading my name tag. "I'm Officer Danny Reeves. I couldn't help but notice that our suspect seemed to recognize you back there. Are you sure you don't know him?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp and suspicious. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral and met his gaze directly. "Like I told Dr. Harrison, I've never seen that man before. Head trauma patients often experience confusion and disorientation. They see faces and think they recognize people when they don't. It's actually very common in cases like this." I was amazed at how smoothly the lies were coming now, how easily I could slip into this new version of myself that was willing to deceive and manipulate to get what I wanted. Officer Reeves studied me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to decide whether to believe me or not. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Nurse Brooks, but if you remember anything at all that might help us with this case, you need to call me immediately." He handed me his card, and I took it with steady fingers, even though inside I was screaming. "This guy Ellison, he's bad news. The woman he attacked tonight, Lena Carter, she told us some disturbing things. We think he might be connected to some other cases we've been investigating. Financial crimes may be worse, so if you hear anything while you're treating him, we need to know." The moment Officer Reeves mentioned financial crimes, I felt that note practically vibrating in my pocket, and I had to resist the urge to pull it out and hand it over right then and there. But I didn't, because I had realized something important. If I gave the police that note now, they would take over the investigation. Mark would get arrested, and yes, he would probably go to prison. But he would also get a lawyer. He would get due process. He would get a chance to spin his story and maybe even get a plea deal. And most importantly, I would never know the full truth. I would never know how deep his crimes went, how many people he had hurt, how long he had been lying to me. And I needed to know, I deserved to know. So instead of telling Officer Reeves about the note, I just nodded and said, "Of course, officer. If I hear anything suspicious, you'll be the first person I call." Another lie. So easy now, sliding off my tongue like silk. He seemed satisfied with that answer and left the supply room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and my terrible secret. I pulled the note out of my pocket and read it again, memorizing every word, every number, every detail. Then I took out my phone and quickly snapped several photos of the note from different angles, making sure the text was clear and legible. I uploaded those photos to a secure cloud storage account that only I could access, and then I carefully folded the note and put it back in my pocket. I knew what I had to do next. I had to find Lena Carter and hear her story. I had to understand what Mark had done to her, what he had been planning to do, and what secrets she was keeping that had made him so desperate to silence her. But I also knew that I had to be smart about this. I couldn't just walk up to a victim of an assault and start asking questions. I needed a reason, a cover story, something that would make sense. And then it hit me. I was a nurse. It was literally my job to check on patients and make sure they were okay. All I had to do was find out where Lena Carter was being treated. I walked back out into the main emergency department and casually asked the triage nurse, "Hey, Sarah, wasn't there a female assault victim who came in with the police earlier? I thought I was supposed to do a follow-up exam, but I can't find her chart." Sarah glanced at her computer screen and nodded. "Yeah, Lena Carter. She's in exam room 7. Pretty shaken up, but no serious physical injuries. Mostly just bruising and psychological trauma. Dr. Martinez already saw her, and she's waiting for the police to finish taking her statement before she can be discharged." Perfect. I thanked Sarah and made my way toward exam room 7, my mind already formulating what I would say to Lena Carter when I walked through that door. But as I got closer, I heard voices coming from inside the room, and I recognized one of them immediately. It was Officer Reeves, the same cop who had just questioned me about knowing Mark. I pressed myself against the wall outside the door and listened, and what I heard made my blood run cold all over again. Lena Carter's voice was trembling as she spoke to Officer Reeves, and I could hear the raw fear and exhaustion in every word that came through that thin door separating us. "I'm telling you, officer, Mark Ellison has been terrorizing me for months now, ever since I discovered what he was doing at the firm where I work. I'm just a paralegal. I wasn't supposed to see those documents, but I was filing papers late one night, and I found them hidden in a case file that had been marked as closed. Financial records, offshore accounts, money being moved around in patterns that made no sense unless you understood what you were looking at. And I understood, officer. I understood perfectly because my father was an accountant before he died, and he taught me how to read balance sheets and transaction records." Officer Reeves interrupted her. "What kind of financial records are we talking about, Miss Carter? What exactly did you find?" There was a pause, and I imagined Lena taking a deep breath, gathering her courage to speak the words that would change everything. "Money laundering, officer. Mark Ellison has been laundering money through the law firm for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Millions of dollars moving through shell companies and fake clients, all of it carefully disguised as legitimate legal fees and settlements. But it wasn't legitimate. It was dirty money from God knows where, being cleaned and funneled into accounts that couldn't be traced. I felt my knees go weak again, and I had to lean against the wall to keep myself upright because suddenly Everything made sense in the most horrible way possible. The expensive cars Mark bought with cash, the luxury watches, the sudden trips to the Cayman Islands that he claimed were for business, the way he always had money even when the economy crashed and other people were struggling. It had all been dirty money, blood money, and I had been living off it, sleeping next to it, wearing jewelry bought with it, completely oblivious to the truth. Officer Reeves was asking more questions now, his voice sharp with interest. "Did you make copies of these documents? Do you have proof of what you're alleging?" Lena's response was immediate and firm. "Of course I made copies. I'm not stupid. I knew that if Mark found out I had discovered his scheme, he would try to silence me one way or another. So I copied everything, every document, every transaction record, every account number. I put it all on a flash drive and I hid it somewhere safe, somewhere Mark could never find it, even if he tore my entire life apart looking for it." The officer pressed further. "And when did Mark find out that you knew about the money laundering? When did he start threatening you?" Lena's voice broke slightly as she answered. "About 6 weeks ago, I made a mistake. I was researching one of the shell companies online, trying to figure out who was really behind it, and I forgot to clear my browser history on my work computer. Mark saw it. He came to my desk the next morning and he was all smiles and charm, but his eyes were dead. He asked me to come to his office for a private meeting, and when I got there, he closed the door and his whole demeanor changed. He told me I had seen something I shouldn't have seen, and that I had two choices. I could take a very generous payment to forget everything I knew and sign a non-disclosure agreement, or I could face the consequences of being a whistleblower who nobody would believe. Officer Reeves asked the question I was thinking. "How much money did he offer you?" Lena laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. $500,000, officer. $500,000 to keep my mouth shut and pretend I never saw anything. He made it sound so reasonable, so simple. He said I could pay off my student loans, buy a house, start a new life somewhere far away from Charlotte. All I had to do was sign the papers and take the money, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't let him get away with it, so I told him no. There was a long silence, and then Officer Reeves spoke again, his voice heavy with concern. "Miss Carter, when you refused his offer, what did Mark Ellison do?" Lena's response was barely a whisper, but I heard every word clearly. "He told me I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. He said that people who crossed him had a tendency to disappear or meet with unfortunate accidents. He said my apartment could catch fire, or I could get mugged in a parking garage, or I could have a tragic car accident on the highway. He made it sound like he was just listing possibilities, but we both knew they were threats. That's when I went to the police the first time, but I didn't have enough evidence yet to prove anything. They told me to get a restraining order and be careful, but a piece of paper doesn't stop a man like Mark Ellison." I was shaking now, physically shaking with rage and horror as I listened to Lena describe the monster I had been living with for 2 years without ever seeing his true face. How had I been so blind? How had I missed all the signs? But even as I asked myself these questions, I knew the answer. Mark had been a master manipulator, showing me only what he wanted me to see, controlling the narrative of our relationship so completely that I never thought to question anything until tonight, when he threw me out and his carefully constructed facade finally cracked wide open. Officer Reeves was wrapping up his interview now. "Miss Carter, I need you to know that we're taking your allegations very seriously. We're going to open a full investigation into Mark Ellison's financial activities, and we're going to need those documents you copied. That flash drive you mentioned, we're going to need that as evidence." Lena's response was firm. "I'll give you the flash drive, officer, but not until I have protection. Mark has connections everywhere, in the police department, in the courts, in the district attorney's office. I don't trust anyone until I know for sure that I'm safe. So I need witness protection. I need a safe house. I need guarantees that Mark Ellison will not be able to reach me before he goes to trial." The officer sighed. "That's going to take time, Miss Carter. I can't authorize witness protection on my own. I need to go through channels, get approvals, make arrangements. It could be days or even weeks before everything is in place. Lena's voice rose with panic. I don't have days or weeks, officer. Mark tried to kill me tonight. He's in this hospital right now, and even though he's injured and under police guard, he has people who work for him, people who would do anything for money. I'm not safe here. I'm not safe anywhere until he's behind bars and I have protection. I realized in that moment that Lena Carter and I were in the same boat, both of us threatened by the same monster, both of us holding pieces of evidence that could destroy him. And suddenly I knew exactly what I had to do. I couldn't go to the police with the note I had found because I had already lied about knowing Mark, and if I came forward now with evidence, they would know I had been hiding something and my credibility would be destroyed. But I could help Lena Carter. I could make sure she stayed safe long enough to bring Mark down, and in the process, I could get my own justice. I took a deep breath, straightened my scrubs, and knocked on the door of exam room 7 before pushing it open and stepping inside with my best professional nurse smile plastered on my face. Officer Reeves looked up in surprise, and Lena Carter stared at me with red-rimmed eyes full of suspicion and fear. I'm sorry to interrupt, officer, but I need to do a follow-up examination on Miss Carter before she can be discharged. Hospital protocol requires that all assault victims receive a complete medical evaluation, and I need to document any injuries for legal purposes. My voice was calm and steady, giving away nothing of the storm raging inside me. Officer Reeves nodded and stood up from his chair. Of course, Nurse Brooks. I was just finishing up here anyway. Miss Carter, I'll be right outside if you need anything, and I'll have an officer posted at your door until we can make arrangements for your safety. He gave Lena what I'm sure he thought was a reassuring smile, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. And she was right not to. As soon as Officer Reeves left the room and closed the door behind him, I turned to Lena and spoke in a low voice that couldn't be heard outside. Miss Carter, my name is Diana Brooks, and I need you to listen to me very carefully because we don't have much time. I know who Mark Ellison is. I know what he's capable of, and I know that you're in danger as long as he's alive and breathing in this hospital. Lena's eyes went wide with shock, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to stop her. Please, just listen. I was Mark's girlfriend until about 12 hours ago when he threw me out of his house. I had no idea what he was really doing. I had no idea about the money laundering or the threats or any of it. But tonight, when they brought him into this emergency room, I found something in his jacket pocket, a note that proves he was planning to hurt you, maybe kill you. And I think that note, combined with the evidence you have on that flash drive, could put Mark away for the rest of his life. Lena stared at me with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. Why should I trust you? How do I know you're not working with Mark, trying to find out where I hid the flash drive so you can destroy the evidence? It was a fair question, and I had anticipated it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled note, unfolding it carefully and holding it out so Lena could read it. Because if I was working with Mark, I would have destroyed this note the second I found it. Instead, I've been carrying it around like a ticking time bomb, trying to figure out what to do with it. I lied to the police about knowing Mark because I didn't want them to take over this investigation before I could understand what was really going on. But now I know, and now I want to help you bring him down. Lena took the note from my hands with trembling fingers and read it slowly, her face going pale as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is dated for Friday. That's tomorrow. He was going to kill me tomorrow and make it look like an accident." She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "You saved my life by finding this note. If you had given it to the police, they would have arrested Mark, but his lawyers would have gotten him out on bail within hours. And then he would have come after me before I could testify. But if we're smart about this, if we work together, we can make sure he never sees the outside of a prison cell again." I I felt a surge of relief and determination as I realized that Lena understood exactly what I was thinking. We were stronger together than we were apart. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. "You have the financial evidence that proves Mark has been laundering money for years. I have the note that proves he was planning to murder you. Together, we have enough to destroy him completely. But we need to be strategic. We can't just hand everything over to the police and hope for the best. We need to make sure the evidence gets into the right hands, people who can't be bought or intimidated by Mark's connections." Lena nodded eagerly. "I know someone, a federal prosecutor named Sarah Chen, who specializes in financial crimes and organized crime. She's incorruptible, she's brilliant, and she's been trying to build a case against the law firm where I work for years, but she's never had enough evidence to move forward. If we give her everything we have, she'll know exactly what to do with it. She'll get warrants, she'll freeze Mark's assets, she'll build an airtight case that no lawyer can wiggle out of." It sounded perfect, almost too perfect, and I felt a flicker of suspicion. "How do you know this prosecutor? How can you be sure she's trustworthy?" Lena met my eyes with absolute certainty. "Because Sarah Chen is my cousin. We grew up together. We're like sisters. I've been feeding her bits and pieces of information about the law firm for months, but I've been too scared to give her everything because I knew Mark would retaliate. But now that he's already tried to kill me, I have nothing left to lose. And with your note as additional evidence, Sarah will have everything she needs to take Mark down and everyone he's been working with." I felt a smile spreading across my face for the first time in what felt like years. This was it. This was how we were going to win. "Okay," I said, my voice filled with newfound confidence. "Here's the plan. You're going to stay in this hospital under police protection until we can arrange a meeting with your cousin Sarah. I'm going to make copies of this note, and I'm going to document everything I observed in Mark's medical treatment tonight. And then we're going to hand everything over to Sarah Chen at the same time, in a coordinated way that gives Mark no chance to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We're going to bury him so deep that he'll never see daylight again." Lena reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "Thank you, Diana. Thank you for believing me, for helping me, for being brave enough to do the right thing even when it's dangerous. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't found that note." I squeezed her hand back, feeling a connection forming between us that went beyond our shared trauma. We were warriors now, fighting the same battle against the same enemy, and we were going to win. But even as I felt that surge of hope and determination, I heard a commotion outside in the hallway, shouting voices and running footsteps and the sound of something crashing to the floor. Officer Reeves burst through the door of exam room 7 with his gun drawn, his face pale with shock. "We have a situation," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Mark Ellison is awake and he's demanding to be released from the hospital. He's threatening to sue everyone, he's calling his lawyers, and he's claiming that he's being held against his will. We need to move Miss Carter to a secure location immediately because if Ellison makes bail or gets released, she's in immediate danger." My heart dropped into my stomach as I processed Officer Reeves's words because I knew exactly what was happening. Mark was awake, which meant he was thinking clearly enough to realize that I had found the note and that Lena was somewhere in this hospital talking to the police about his crimes. He was going into full damage control mode, using every tool in his arsenal to protect himself and eliminate anyone who could threaten him. And his most powerful tool was his money and his connections to lawyers who could twist the law into knots until black became white and guilty became innocent. Officer Reeves was already on his radio calling for backup and making arrangements to move Lena to a safe location. But I could see the panic in Lena's eyes as she realized that time was running out faster than any of us had anticipated. "Diana, what do we do?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "If Mark gets out of this hospital before we can get the evidence to my cousin Sarah, he'll disappear. He'll take his money and run to some country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, and we'll never be able to touch him. Or worse, he'll come after both of us before he runs." I forced myself to think clearly despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "We need to move faster than Mark can. Officer Reeves, how long before you can get Miss Carter into protective custody?" The officer looked at his watch and grimaced. "At least 2 hours, maybe 3. I need to coordinate. With the marshals, arrange transportation, set up a safe house. This isn't something that can be rushed without compromising security." 2 or 3 hours was an eternity when Mark Ellison was awake and making phone calls to high-powered attorneys who could have him out of police custody before dawn. An idea struck me with the force of lightning, dangerous and brilliant at the same time. What if we don't wait for protective custody? What if we go straight to the prosecutor right now, tonight, before Mark has a chance to lawyer up and shut everything down? Officer Reeves looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Nurse Brooks, that's not how this works. We have protocols, procedures, chains of command. We can't just bypass the entire system because we're in a hurry." But Lena was already nodding, her eyes lighting up with desperate hope. "Diana's right, officer. My cousin Sarah lives 20 minutes from here. If we can get to her house tonight with all the evidence, she can start the legal process immediately. She can get emergency warrants, freeze Mark's assets, put him on a no-fly list so he can't leave the country. She can do in 1 hour what it would take your department days or weeks to accomplish." Officer Reeves looked torn between following protocol and doing what was obviously the right thing in this situation. I could see him weighing his options, calculating the risks, trying to figure out if his career could survive the fallout of bending the rules so dramatically. I decided to push him over the edge. "Officer, you heard what Miss Carter told you about Mark having connections in the police department and the district attorney's office. You don't know who you can trust, but you can trust a federal prosecutor who has no ties to the local system. If you let us go to Sarah Chen tonight, you'll be protecting a witness and potentially breaking open one of the biggest financial crime cases this city has ever seen. If you insist on following protocol, you might be giving Mark Ellison exactly the time he needs to escape justice and possibly hurt more people." I watched Officer Reeves's face as he made his decision, and I saw the moment he chose to be a hero instead of a bureaucrat. "All right," he said, holstering his weapon and pulling out his phone. "But I'm coming with you, and so is my partner. We're not letting Miss Carter out of our sight until she's somewhere safe. And Nurse Brooks, you need to understand that if this goes sideways, if Sarah Chen can't or won't help us, you could be charged with interfering in a police investigation and aiding a witness in avoiding proper protective custody." I nodded, accepting the risk because I had come too far to turn back now. "I understand, officer. Let's go." The next 20 minutes were a blur of activity as Officer Reeves coordinated with his partner, signed out Lena from the hospital under a false name to avoid creating a paper trail that Mark could follow, and arranged for an unmarked police car to transport us across the city to Sarah Chen's house. I went back to the trauma bay where Mark was being held and quietly retrieved my personal belongings from my locker, being careful to avoid any contact with the patient who had once been the center of my world and was now the target of my carefully constructed revenge. As I walked past Trauma Room 1, I could hear Mark's voice raised in anger, demanding to speak to his attorney, threatening lawsuits against the hospital and the police department, insisting that he was the victim of a setup and that everyone was conspiring against him. It was almost funny how he could twist reality so completely in his own mind, how he could convince himself that he was the innocent party when he was actually a money launderer and an attempted murderer. But I didn't stop to listen to his rants. I had more important things to do. Officer Reeves met me at the emergency room exit with Lena Carter between him and his partner, both officers scanning the parking lot for any signs of threat. "My car is over there," I said, pointing to my aging Honda Civic in the far corner of the lot. Officer Reeves shook his head. "We're not taking your car, too easy to trace. We're using an unmarked unit. You'll ride with Miss Carter in the back. My partner will drive, and I'll follow in a second unit to make sure we're not being tailed. If everything goes according to plan, we'll be at Sarah Chen's house in 15 minutes, and this nightmare will finally start to end." We piled into the unmarked police car and pulled out of the hospital parking lot just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. I looked back at the building where I had spent so many years of my life saving people, and I wondered if I would ever be able to work there again after tonight. I had lied to my colleagues, stolen evidence, and was now actively participating in what could be considered vigilante justice. But I couldn't bring myself to regret any of it, because for the first time in my life, I was fighting back against someone who had hurt me instead of just accepting the damage and moving on. Lena was trembling next to me in the back seat, and I reached over to take her hand. "It's going to be okay," I told her, even though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. "Your cousin is going to help us, and by this time tomorrow, Mark is going to be in federal custody, facing charges that will put him away for decades." Lena squeezed my hand and gave me a shaky smile. "I hope you're right, Diana. I really hope you're right. Because if we fail, if Mark somehow gets away with this, he's going to come after both of us with everything he has. And men like Mark Ellison don't forgive, and they don't forget." The drive across Charlotte was tense and silent except for the crackle of police radio traffic and the sound of Officer Reeves checking in with his partner every few minutes to confirm we weren't being followed. I kept watching the cars behind us, looking for any sign that we had been spotted or tracked. But the early morning streets were mostly empty, and nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong, that we were moving too fast and being too reckless, and that any minute now the whole plan would collapse around us. We finally pulled up in front of a modest townhouse in a quiet residential neighborhood, and Officer Reeves's partner killed the engine while scanning the area for threats. "This is it," Lena said, pointing to the house with the blue door and the flower boxes in the windows. "Sarah lives here with her partner. They're both early risers, so she should be awake even though it's barely 5 in the morning." Officer Reeves got out of his vehicle and approached our car, his hand resting on his weapon out of habit. "All right, ladies, here's how this is going to work. We're going to walk up to that door together, we're going to ring the bell, and we're going to wait for Sarah Chen to answer. If anything feels wrong, if anything seems off, we abort immediately and get back in the cars. Understood?" We all nodded and climbed out of the unmarked police car, forming a tight group as we approached Sarah Chen's front door. Lena reached out and pressed the doorbell, and we heard it chime inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a petite Asian woman in her early 40s, wearing yoga pants and a Georgetown Law sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and her face showing surprise at finding a group of people on her doorstep at such an early hour. "Lena," she said, her eyes widening with concern as she took in her cousin's bruised face and frightened expression. "What happened? Are you okay?" Lena's composure finally broke and she started crying, throwing her arms around her cousin and sobbing into her shoulder. "Sarah, I need your help. We need your help. It's Mark Ellison. He tried to kill me tonight, and we have evidence that he's been laundering money through the law firm for years, and we need you to do something before he gets away or hurts someone else." The words tumbled out in a rush, barely coherent, but Sarah Chen's expression shifted from concern to fierce determination as she processed what her cousin was telling her. Sarah stepped back and held the door open wide, ushering all of us into her house with the quick efficiency of someone who was used to making split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. "Everyone inside now. We'll talk in my office where it's secure." She led us through a tastefully decorated living room and down a hallway to a home office that was lined with law books and legal documents. Sarah closed the door behind us and turned to face our group with her arms crossed and her prosecutor's eyes assessing each person in the room. "Okay, I need someone to explain to me exactly what's going on, and I need the explanation to be clear, concise, and supported by evidence. Lena, start from the beginning." Lena took a deep breath and launched into her story, explaining how she had discovered the money laundering scheme at the law firm, how Mark had threatened her when she refused his bribe, and how he had attacked her tonight at the bar before the police intervened. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each detail. When Lena finished, Sarah turned to me. "And who are you? How do you fit into this picture?" I introduced myself and explained my relationship with Mark, the note I had found in his jacket, and my decision to help Lena bring him down, instead of just handing the evidence to the police. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied me. "So you lied to the police about knowing the suspect, you withheld evidence from an active investigation, and you convinced these officers to bring a witness directly to me instead of following proper protective custody protocols. Nurse Brooks, you do realize that what you've done could be considered obstruction of justice?" My heart sank because I had been so focused on stopping Mark that I hadn't fully considered the legal consequences of my own actions. But before I could respond, Sarah's stern expression softened into something that almost looked like approval. "However, I also recognize that you were operating in a situation where time was critical, and you had reason to believe that following standard procedures might compromise the witness's safety. And more importantly, you've potentially handed me evidence that could break open a case I've been trying to build for 3 years. She turned to Officer Reeves. "Danny, I know you. You're a good cop, and you wouldn't have brought these women to my door unless you believed this was legitimate. What's your assessment of the situation?" Officer Reeves straightened up slightly, clearly relieved to be asked for his professional opinion. "Ma'am, I believe Miss Carter is in genuine danger from Mark Ellison, and that the evidence they're describing could be significant. I also believe that time is a critical factor here. Ellison was making phone calls to his attorneys before we left the hospital, and if we don't move fast, he's going to walk out of there and either flee the country or eliminate the witnesses against him." Sarah nodded and turned to her desk, pulling out a legal pad and a pen. "All right, here's what's going to happen. Lena, I need you to give me that flash drive with all the financial documents. Diana, I need that note, and I need you to write out a detailed statement about how you came to possess it, when you found it, and what condition it was in. Officers, I need you to write up incident reports documenting everything that happened tonight, from the original assault to this moment right now. And then I'm going to spend the next hour reviewing everything and making phone calls to some very important people who are going to be very unhappy about being woken up at dawn, but who are going to be very interested in what I have to show them." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity as we all worked to compile the evidence and documentation that Sarah needed. Lena produced the flash drive from a hiding place in her shoe where she had kept it even through the assault, and Sarah immediately plugged it into her computer to verify that the files were intact and legitimate. I wrote out my statement with painstaking detail, making sure to include every observation and every interaction I had witnessed. Officer Reeves and his partner filled out their reports, documenting the assault, the hostage situation, and the decision to bring Lena directly to Sarah Chen instead of following standard protective custody procedures. As Sarah reviewed the documents and financial records, I watched her face transform from professional interest to barely contained excitement. "This is incredible," she muttered, almost to herself. "These records show money moving through at least 15 different shell companies, all of them linked back to the law firm where Lena works. And the amounts are staggering. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being laundered over a 3-year period. This isn't just Mark Ellison running a small side operation. This is organized crime. This is international money laundering. This is potentially connected to drug cartels or human trafficking or weapons dealing. This is huge." She picked up her phone and started making calls, speaking in rapid-fire legal terminology to people I assumed were other federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and judges who could issue warrants. I heard phrases like emergency asset seizure, material witness protection, RICO charges, and no-knock warrant. Each call seemed to add another layer to the case Sarah was building, and I could see the web tightening around Mark Ellison with every word she spoke. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, Sarah hung up her phone and turned to address all of us with a triumphant smile on her face. "We did it," she said simply. "I just got approval from a federal judge for emergency warrants to freeze all of Mark Ellison's known assets, search his home and office, and arrest him on charges of money laundering, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The FBI is coordinating with local police to execute the warrants within the next 2 hours. And Lena, you're being placed in federal witness protection effective immediately. You'll be transported to a secure facility where you'll stay until the trial, and you'll have 24-hour protection from U.S. Marshals." Lena started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than fear. "It's really over?" she asked in disbelief. "Mark can't hurt me anymore?" Sarah reached out and hugged her cousin tightly. "It's really over. Mark Ellison is going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and you're going to be safe. I promise you that." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me as I watched the two cousins embrace, and I realized that we had actually done it. We had taken down a monster using nothing but courage, evidence, and a willingness to bend the rules when the situation demanded it. But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned to me with a serious expression. "Diana, you need to understand that there will be consequences for the choices you made tonight. You lied to the police, you withheld evidence, and you inserted yourself into an active criminal investigation. Those are serious matters that could result in criminal charges or at minimum the loss of your nursing license. However, I'm going to do everything in my power to protect you from those consequences, because what you did ultimately helped us build a case that will put dangerous criminals behind bars. I can't make any guarantees, but I'm going to argue that you acted in good faith to protect a witness and that your actions were justified given the circumstances." I nodded, accepting that my choices had come with a price, but not regretting them for a second. "I understand, Sarah. Whatever happens to me, it was worth it to stop Mark and to help Lena. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while he hurt people." Sarah gave me an approving nod. "That's exactly the attitude that's going to help you when we go before the review boards and the licensing authorities. You're a good person, Diana Brooks, and you deserve better than what Mark Ellison put you through. I'm going to make sure you come out of this okay." The sun was fully up by the time we left Sarah Chen's house, and the morning light felt like a new beginning after the darkness of the previous 12 hours. Officer Reeves drove Lena and me back toward the hospital where we had left our cars, but the radio chatter was now filled with reports of FBI agents executing search warrants at multiple locations across Charlotte. I heard Mark's name mentioned several times, along with phrases like "suspect in custody" and "assets frozen pending investigation." It was really happening. The walls were closing in on Mark Ellison, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Officer Reeves dropped me off at the hospital parking lot and gave me his card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. "Nurse Brooks, you're going to need to give a formal statement to the FBI within the next few days about how you came to possess that note and what you observed during Mark Ellison's treatment. I'm going to put in a good word for you with my contacts at the Bureau, and I'm going to make sure they understand that you were operating under extreme duress and that your actions ultimately serve the interests of justice. But you should probably get yourself a lawyer, just to be safe." I thanked him and watched as the unmarked police car pulled away, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot, where just hours earlier I had arrived as a heartbroken woman who had been thrown out of her home. Now I was something different. I was a whistleblower, an accomplice, a hero, and possibly a criminal all at the same time. My life was never going to be the same, but somehow that felt okay, because the person I had been before tonight had been weak and blind and willing to accept abuse without fighting back. The person I was now knew how to fight, knew how to stand up for herself and for others, and knew that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to achieve true justice. I climbed into my car and drove back to my friend's apartment where I'd been staying since Mark threw me out. I needed to shower, to sleep, to process everything that had happened. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Mark's car, his distinctive black BMW with the personalized license plate, was parked right in front of my friend's building. He had somehow found out where I was staying. He had come looking for me. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel as I realized what this meant. Mark had either been released from the hospital against medical advice, or he had escaped somehow before the FBI could arrest him. And now he was here, probably waiting for me, probably planning to hurt me or threaten me or force me to tell him what I knew and who I had talked to. I reached for my phone to call Officer Reeves, but before I could dial, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. Mark was walking toward my car from the building entrance, and his face was a mask of cold fury. I locked my doors and fumbled with my phone, but Mark was faster. He positioned himself directly in front of my car so I couldn't drive away without running him over, and he started pounding on my hood with his fists. "Diana!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "I know what you did. I know you took my note, and I know you talked to that bitch, Lena Carter. You think you're so smart. You think you can ruin my life and get away with it? I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to make you wish you had never been born." I was terrified, but I forced myself to stay calm. I kept my doors locked, and I held my phone up so Mark could see that I was calling for help. "The police are on their way, Mark," I said loudly through the closed window. "You need to leave right now before you make things worse for yourself." But Mark just laughed, a horrible sound that was more like ass snarl than human laughter. "Worse for myself? Diana, I'm already finished. The FBI froze all my accounts this morning. They arrested my partners at the law firm. They're executing search warrants at my house right now. My lawyers tell me I'm looking at 20 years minimum in federal prison. So tell me, how exactly could things get worse for me?" He leaned forward and pressed his face against my windshield, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. "But you know what? I'm not going down alone. If I'm going to prison, I'm taking you with me. I'm going to tell the FBI that you were in on the money laundering from the beginning, that you helped me set up the shell companies, that you knew exactly where the money was coming from. I'm going to destroy your career, your reputation, everything. And there's nothing you can do to stop me because it's your word against mine." I stared at Mark through the glass, and I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as the charming businessman I had fallen in love with, not as the controlling boyfriend who had dominated my life, but as a pathetic, desperate man who had lost everything because of his own greed and cruelty. And in that moment, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. "Go ahead, Mark," I said calmly. "Tell the FBI whatever you want. Tell them I was involved. Tell them I knew everything. Tell them whatever lies you think will save you. But here's what I know. I have a clean record. I have colleagues who will testify to my character, and I have evidence that I was trying to stop you, not help you. You have nothing but accusations and desperation. So who do you think they're going to believe?" Mark's face contorted with rage, and he raised his fist like he was going to smash my windshield. But then we both heard the sirens approaching. Multiple police cars were converging on the parking lot, and I saw FBI agents in tactical gear jumping out of black SUVs with their weapons drawn. "Mark Ellison!" one of the agents shouted through a megaphone. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands on your head. You are under arrest for money laundering, attempted murder, witness intimidation, and violation of federal restraining order. Do not resist." Mark looked around wildly, realizing that he was surrounded and that there was no escape. For just a second, his eyes met mine through the windshield, and I saw something in them that might have been regret or might have been hatred. Then he slowly raised his hands and placed them on his head, and the FBI agents moved in to arrest him. I watched as they handcuffed him, read him his rights, and loaded him into the back of one of their vehicles, and as the car pulled away with Mark inside, I felt something lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was over. It was finally, really over. One of the FBI agents approached my car and knocked politely on the window. I rolled it down and she showed me her badge. "Miss Brooks, I'm Special Agent Maria Rodriguez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need you to come with us to give a formal statement about your knowledge of Mark Ellison's activities. I understand you've had a traumatic experience, but I promise we'll make this as painless as possible. We're not here to charge you with anything. We're here to thank you for helping us catch a very dangerous criminal." I followed Agent Rodriguez to the FBI field office in downtown Charlotte, where I spent the next 6 hours giving the most detailed statement of my life. I told them everything, from the beginning of my relationship with Mark to the moment I found the note in his jacket pocket. I told them about the lies I had told to the police, about my decision to help Lena Carter, about going to Sarah Chen instead of following proper procedures. I held nothing back because I had decided that I was done with secrets and lies and half-truths. If I was going to face consequences for my actions, I would face them honestly. To my surprise, the FBI agents treated me like a hero rather than a suspect. They told me that the note I had found was a crucial piece of evidence that tied Mark directly to the attempted murder of Lena Carter, and that without it, they might have had trouble proving intent. They told me that my detailed observations about Mark's behavior and his connections to the law firm had helped them identify other potential suspects and co-conspirators. And they told me that while my methods had been unorthodox, they understood why I had made the choices I did, and they would be recommending that no charges be filed against me. By the time I left the FBI office, it was late afternoon and I was exhausted beyond words. But I felt lighter than I had in years, like I had been carrying a massive weight and had finally been allowed to put it down. My phone had dozens of missed calls and text messages from colleagues at the hospital, from friends who had heard about Mark's arrest on the news, and from reporters who wanted to interview me about my role in bringing down a major money laundering operation. I ignored all of them, except for one message from Sarah Chen that simply said, "You did good, Diana. Lena is safe, and Mark is going away for a very long time. Thank you for being brave." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal reckoning. Mark Ellison was formally charged with 17 counts of money laundering, 1 count of attempted murder, 3 counts of witness intimidation, and numerous other federal crimes. The investigation expanded to include other members of the law firm where he worked and eventually led to the arrests of 6 other lawyers and accountants who'd been helping him move dirty money through the financial system. The total amount of money involved turned out to be over $400 million, most of it connected to a drug cartel operating out of Mexico. I was called to testify before a federal grand jury about my discovery of the note and my observations of Mark's behavior. I was nervous about facing Mark in a courtroom, but when the day came, I found that I wasn't afraid anymore. I walked into that courtroom with my head held high and I told the truth about everything that had happened. Mark stared at me from the defendant's table with empty eyes, and I realized that he had already given up. He knew he was going to prison for the rest of his life, and there was nothing left for him to fight for. The grand jury returned indictments on all charges, and Mark's lawyers immediately started negotiating a plea deal to avoid a trial. In the end, Mark agreed to plead guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a sentence of 25 years without possibility of parole. It wasn't life in prison, but it was close enough. By the time he got out, he would be almost 60 years old, and all his money and power and connections would be gone. He would be nothing but a bitter old man with a prison record and no future. Lena Carter remained in witness protection for several months while the cases against Mark and his co-conspirators moved through the courts, but eventually she was allowed to resume her normal life under a new identity in a different city. She called me a few times to thank me and to tell me about her new job and her new life, and I could hear in her voice that she was finally free of the fear that had haunted her for so long. She had survived. We had both survived, and we had won. As for me, I faced review from the North Carolina Board of Nursing regarding my actions on the night I found the note. Sarah Chen personally appeared at my hearing to testify about how my choices had helped break open a major federal case, and Officer Danny Reeves submitted a written statement supporting my actions. In the end, the board decided that while my methods had been questionable, my intentions had been good, and my ultimate impact had been positive. They issued me a formal reprimand but allowed me to keep my nursing license. It was a fair outcome, and I accepted it with gratitude. The hospital where I worked was less forgiving. The administration was uncomfortable with all the media attention I had brought to their facility, and they were concerned about the liability issues raised by my treatment of Mark while having an undisclosed personal relationship with him. They offered me the option to resign voluntarily rather than face termination, and I took it. It was time for a fresh start anyway. 6 months after that terrible night when Mark threw me out and destiny threw him back into my emergency room, I was standing in a very different kind of room, preparing for a very different kind of life. I had left Charlotte and moved to Asheville in the mountains of western North Carolina, and I had accepted a position at a small community hospital that specialized in rural health care. It was a complete change from the high-pressure trauma environment I was used to, but it felt right. It felt like a place where I could heal and rebuild and become the person I was meant to be before Mark Ellison had twisted me into someone small and scared and silent. My new apartment was modest but comfortable, with big windows that looked out over the Blue Ridge Mountains and let in the kind of natural light I had forgotten existed during my years in Mark's dark house. I had furnished it simply with things I actually liked instead of things Mark had chosen for me. And every object in every room was a reminder that this space was mine and mine, alone. Nobody was going to throw me out. Nobody was going to control what I did or who I talked to or how I spent my time. I was free. The local newspaper had done a story about my role in bringing down the money laundering operation, and the response from the community had been overwhelmingly positive. People stopped me on the street to shake my hand and tell me I was brave. The hospital where I worked put up a small plaque in the break room commemorating my actions, though I found it embarrassing and tried to avoid looking at it. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had simply done what needed to be done when the moment demanded it. But the person who had been most affected by everything that happened wasn't me or Lena Carter or even Mark Ellison himself. It was Mark's mother, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who I had met only a handful of times during my relationship with her son. She was a dignified woman in her 70s who'd been completely blindsided by the revelation of what Mark had been doing, and she had reached out to me through Sarah Chen, asking if we could meet and talk. I agreed to the meeting with some trepidation because I wasn't sure what Patricia wanted from me. Was she going to blame me for her son's downfall? Was she going to beg me to recant my testimony or to somehow help Mark get a reduced sentence? I prepared myself for anger or manipulation or guilt trips, but what I got instead was something completely unexpected. Patricia Ellison met me at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Asheville on a crisp autumn morning, and from the moment she sat down across from me, I could see that she was a woman in pain. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Diana," she said softly. "I know you have no reason to trust me or to care about what I have to say, but I needed to speak with you face to face. I needed to tell you how sorry I am for everything my son put you through." I was so surprised by her apology that I didn't know how to respond at first. "Mrs. Ellison, you don't need to apologize to me. You didn't do anything wrong. You're not responsible for Mark's choices." Patricia shook her head firmly. "But I am responsible, Diana. I'm his mother. I raised him. I shaped him. And somewhere along the way, I failed him completely. I was so focused on his success, on his achievements, on making sure he had every advantage in life that I never taught him about empathy or compassion or treating other people with basic human decency. I created a monster, and you suffered because of it. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope which she slid across the table toward me. "This is for you. It's not much, just $50,000 from my own savings, but I want you to have it. I want you to use it to start over, to build a new life, to do something good in the world that will help balance out some of the evil that Mark has. Done. Please, Diana, let me do this one thing to try to make amends." I stared at the envelope in shock. $50,000 was a life-changing amount of money, especially for someone like me who'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years. I could pay off my student loans. I could buy a car that didn't break down every other month. I could finally have some financial security. But taking money from Mark's mother felt wrong somehow, like I would be profiting from the same criminal enterprise that had destroyed so many lives. I pushed the envelope back across the table. "Mrs. Ellison, I appreciate the gesture more than you know, but I can't accept this. Your money isn't tainted by what Mark did, and you shouldn't have to give up your savings to atone for his crimes. Keep your money. Use it to take care of yourself. That's what Mark should have been doing instead of laundering money for drug cartels." Patricia looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "You're a good person, Diana, a much better person than my son deserved. I hope you find happiness and peace. I truly do." We talked for another hour about everything that had happened, and Patricia told me stories about Mark's childhood that helped me understand how he had become the man he was. She told me about his father who had been abusive and controlling, about the pressure she had put on Mark to be successful at any cost, about the way money and status had become more important than character or integrity in their family. It was a sad story, but it didn't excuse anything Mark had done. It just explained it. When I left the coffee shop that day, I felt like I'd finally closed the last chapter of my relationship with Mark Ellison. I had forgiven his mother even though she didn't need my forgiveness, and I had let go of the last remnants of anger and bitterness that had been eating away at me. I was ready to move forward completely, to embrace my new life without any shadows from my past holding me back. The months continued to pass, and I settled into my new routine in Asheville. I made friends with my colleagues at the hospital. I started hiking in the mountains on my days off. I even went on a few dates with a kind physical therapist named James, who made me laugh and treated me with respect. Nothing serious came of it, but it felt good to know that I could open my heart to someone new without immediately expecting them to hurt me the way Mark had. I was healing, slowly but surely, and every day felt a little bit lighter than the one before. Then one day in early spring, almost a year after that fateful night in the emergency room, I received a call from Sarah Chen that I hadn't been expecting. "Diana, I have news," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "The FBI's investigation into Mark Ellison's money laundering operation has uncovered something huge. They found evidence that connects Mark to 3 unsolved murders that occurred over the past 5 years. People who were about to expose his criminal activities, people who refused to be intimidated or bought off, people like Lena Carter who stood up to him. Mark wasn't just a money launderer, Diana. He was a killer." My knees went weak, and I had to sit down as Sarah's words sank in. Mark had killed people. The man I had slept next to for 2 years, the man whose coffee I had made every morning, the man who had told me he loved me while hiding bodies in his wake. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized just how close I had come to being one of his victims. If I hadn't found that note, if I hadn't helped Lena, if things had gone just slightly differently, I might be dead right now, and Mark would still be walking around free. Sarah continued talking, explaining that the FBI was reopening the murder investigations and that they expected to bring additional charges against Mark within the next few weeks. His plea deal would be voided and he would be facing life in prison without parole instead of the 25-year sentence he had already agreed to. Diana, I need you to know that your actions didn't just save Lena Carter's life. They potentially saved dozens of other lives because Mark is never going to hurt anyone again. You're a hero, whether you want to accept that label or not. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my apartment for a long time, just processing everything I had learned. I thought about how random and chaotic and terrifying life could be, how a single decision or a single moment could change everything. If I hadn't gone to work that night after Mark threw me out, if I hadn't been assigned to the trauma bay where they brought him, if I hadn't found that note, if I hadn't been brave enough to help Lena Carter despite the risks, the entire trajectory of my life would have been different. And not just my life, but the lives of everyone Mark would have hurt if he had continued unchecked. I realized that sometimes fate or destiny, or just plain dumb luck, puts you in a position where you have to make a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right. And the person you become is defined by which choice you make in that moment. I had chosen to do what was right, even though it was dangerous and difficult and potentially ruining for me. And that choice had saved lives, had brought justice, had made me into someone stronger and braver than I ever thought I could be. But I also realized that I couldn't spend the rest of my life defining myself by my relationship with Mark Ellison or by the dramatic events of that one night. I was more than just the woman who brought down a criminal. I was a nurse, a friend, a daughter, a person with dreams and hopes and a future that stretched out before me full of possibilities. It was time to stop looking backward at what had happened and start looking forward to what could happen next. So I made another decision, one that felt just as important as the decision to help Lena Carter. I decided to use my experience to help other people who were trapped in controlling or abusive relationships the way I had been. I started volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, using my medical skills to help treat injured women and children, but also using my story to show them that escape was possible, that they could fight back, that they could win. I became an advocate and a voice for people who had been silenced by fear and manipulation. The work was hard and emotionally draining, but it was also deeply fulfilling in a way that emergency nursing had never quite been. Every woman I helped leave an abusive situation, every child I saw smiling again after being rescued from a violent home, every success story that came out of the shelter felt like a small victory against the darkness that Mark Ellison had represented. I was turning my pain into purpose, and it was healing me in ways I hadn't expected. 2 years after Mark was sentenced to life in prison without parole for money laundering and 3 counts of first-degree murder, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address was from a maximum security federal prison in Pennsylvania where Mark was being held, and for a moment I considered throwing the letter away without opening it. What could Mark possibly have to say to me after everything that had happened? What words could possibly matter at this point? But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope carefully, half expecting it to be full of threats or insults or attempts at manipulation. Instead, what I found was something completely unexpected. It was a letter written in Mark's handwriting, but the tone was different from anything I had ever heard from him before. It was humble, remorseful, human. "Dear Diana," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you after everything I've done. And I know that no apology can ever make up for the pain and fear I caused you. But I'm writing this letter anyway because I need you to know that I understand now what I was and what I did. Prison has given me a lot of time to think about my life and my choices, and I've come to realize that I was a monster. Not because of the crimes I committed, though those were monstrous enough, but because of the way I treated the people who cared about me, especially you." The letter went on for several pages, detailing Mark's gradual recognition of his own cruelty and selfishness. He talked about therapy sessions with a prison psychologist who had helped him understand the roots of his controlling behavior. He talked about reading books and articles about domestic violence and financial crime and recognizing himself in the descriptions of perpetrators. He talked about the crushing guilt and shame he felt when he thought about the lives he had destroyed and the people he had killed. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mark wrote near the end of the letter. "I don't even expect you to believe that my remorse is genuine, but I want you to know that you saved my last victim, Lena Carter, and that by stopping me when you did, you prevented God knows how many other murders and crimes. You were brave when I was a coward. You were strong when I was weak. You were good when I was evil. And I will spend the rest of my life in this prison cell knowing that the world is a better place, because you found that note and chose to do something about it." I read the letter 3 times, trying to figure out if it was genuine or just another manipulation, another attempt by Mark to worm his way into my head and my heart. But eventually, I decided that it didn't matter whether Mark's remorse was real or not. What mattered was that he was locked away forever, where he couldn't hurt anyone else, and that I had moved on with my life and become someone completely different from the frightened woman he had thrown out of his house that night. I wrote back to Mark exactly once, keeping my response short and direct. "Mark, I read your letter, and I understand that you're trying to make amends in the only way you can, from prison. I don't forgive you, but I also don't hate you anymore. You're just a sad reminder of what happens when someone chooses power and money over humanity and compassion. I hope you use the rest of your life to become a better person, even if that better person will never leave that prison cell. As for me, I'm doing well. I'm happy. I'm helping people. And I never think about you unless something like your letter forces me to. That's how it should be. Take care of yourself, Mark. Goodbye." I mailed the letter, and then I threw away his address and his prisoner number, and I promised myself I would never contact him again or respond if he wrote to me again. That chapter was closed forever. My life in Asheville continued to blossom in ways I had never imagined possible during my dark years with Mark. The hospital where I worked promoted me to charge nurse of the emergency department, recognizing my leadership skills and my ability to stay calm under pressure. The domestic violence shelter where I volunteered asked me to join their board of directors, giving me a voice in shaping policies and programs that would help even more women escape dangerous situations. And James, the physical therapist I had dated briefly, came back into my life with a sincere apology for disappearing and a request for a second chance at a relationship. This time, things moved more slowly and more carefully. I had learned from my experience with Mark that relationships needed to be built on honesty, respect, and equality, rather than on passion or chemistry or financial security. James and I spent months just talking and getting to know each other, sharing our hopes and fears and past traumas without judgment or pressure. He told me about his own difficult divorce from a woman who had cheated on him repeatedly, and I told him about Mark and everything that had happened. We compared scars and realized that we both understood what it meant to be hurt by someone you loved and to have to rebuild yourself from the ground up. Eventually, our friendship deepened into something more, and 1 year after reconnecting, we moved in together into a small house on the outskirts of Asheville with a garden and a view of the mountains. It wasn't fancy or expensive or impressive, but it was ours, and it was filled with love and laughter and the kind of peaceful happiness I had thought was impossible for someone like me. James proposed to me on a hiking trail at sunset, getting down on one knee in the dirt with tears in his eyes and a simple silver ring in his hand. And I said yes without hesitation, because I knew this was real, and this was right, and this was forever. We got married in a small ceremony at the domestic violence shelter where I volunteered, surrounded by friends and colleagues and women I had helped over the years who wanted to celebrate this happy ending to my story. Lena Carter came to the wedding using her new identity, and we hugged and cried and laughed about how far we had both come since that terrible night in the emergency room. Sarah Chen gave a toast about justice and courage and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Officer Danny Reeves, who'd become a good friend over the years, gave me away since my own father had passed away long ago. It was perfect in every way that mattered. The local news did a follow-up story about me and Lena on the 2-year anniversary of Mark's conviction, focusing on how we had both rebuilt our lives and found happiness despite everything we had been through. The story went viral on social media, and suddenly I was receiving messages from women all over the country who were trapped in abusive relationships and who saw my story as inspiration to escape. Some of them reached out asking for advice on how to leave safely. Others just wanted to tell me their stories and to hear that someone understood what they were going through. I responded to every single message with compassion and resources and encouragement, knowing that even small gestures of support could make a difference in someone's darkest moment. The attention was overwhelming at times, but it also reinforced my sense of purpose and my belief that everything I had been through had happened for a reason. I had survived Mark Ellison not just so I could live my own life, but so I could help other people survive their own monsters. That was my calling now, my mission, my way of making meaning out of suffering. 3 years after Mark went to prison, I received another unexpected piece of news. Patricia Ellison, Mark's mother, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76. She had left me a substantial inheritance in her will, along with a letter explaining that she wanted me to use the money to continue my advocacy work for domestic violence victims. "You showed me that it's never too late to do the right thing," Patricia wrote. "You gave me hope that good people still exist in this world, even after my son tried to destroy that hope. Please use this gift to help other women escape the kind of darkness that Mark represented. That would give meaning to my life and to my death." I was deeply moved by Patricia's final gesture, and I used her inheritance to establish a foundation that provided financial assistance and legal support to women leaving abusive relationships. We helped pay for emergency housing, for lawyers, for therapy, for job training, for anything that would help a woman establish independence and safety. We called it the Patricia Ellison Second Chance Foundation, naming it after a woman who had tried to atone for her son's sins by helping his victims. Within the first year, we helped over 200 women escape dangerous situations and start new lives. It was exactly the kind of legacy Patricia had hoped for. As for Mark himself, I heard through Sarah Chen that he had become something of a model prisoner, using his financial expertise to teach other inmates about money management and job skills that would help them rebuild their lives after release. It was ironic that the man who had used his financial knowledge for evil was now using it for good, even if it was only within the limited sphere of a prison education program. I didn't know if Mark's transformation was genuine or if it was just another performance, another manipulation, but I chose to believe it was real because that meant something good had come out of even the darkest story. 5 years after that night in the emergency room, James and I welcomed our first child into the world, a healthy baby girl with her father's eyes and her mother's determination. We named her Hope because that's what she represented to us. The possibility of new beginnings and fresh starts and futures, unburdened by the past. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I thought about all the choices I had made that had led to this moment, all the risks I had taken, all the times I had been brave when I wanted to be cowardly, all the times I had chosen to help others even when it would have been easier to look away. And I realized that everything had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every night of doubt, every risk I had taken had brought me to this place of profound happiness and deep purpose. I was no longer the woman Mark Ellison had thrown out of his house that morning. I was Diana Brooks, advocate, mother, wife, survivor, fighter, winner. I had taken my pain and transformed it into power, and I had used that power to change lives, including my own. The years continued to pass, and my story gradually faded from public attention, becoming just another case file in the FBI's archives and just another example in domestic violence training seminars. But for me, it remained the defining experience of my life, the moment when I discovered who I really was and what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. I never forgot that night in the emergency room when destiny threw Mark back into my life one last time. I never forgot the fear and the anger and the determination I felt as I held that crumpled note in my hands and realized I had the power to end his reign of terror. 10 years after Mark Ellison was sentenced to life in prison, I stood in a conference room at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., preparing to give the keynote speech at a national symposium on domestic violence and financial crime. The room was filled with federal agents, prosecutors, victim advocates, and survivors who had come from all over the country to share strategies and stories and to learn from each other's experiences. I was nervous about speaking to such a distinguished audience, but I was also honored to have been chosen to represent the thousands of women who had found the courage to fight back against their abusers. As I looked out at the crowd, I saw Sarah Chen sitting in the front row with Lena Carter next to her, both of them smiling at me with encouragement and pride. I saw Officer Danny Reeves, who had been promoted to detective and now ran a task force on organized crime, giving me a thumbs up. I saw representatives from the Patricia Ellison Second Chance Foundation wearing T-shirts with our logo and distributing information about our services. And I saw my husband James holding our daughter Hope in his arms, both of them waving at me from the back of the room where they had insisted on standing, so they wouldn't distract me during my speech. I took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. My name is Diana Brooks, and 10 years ago, I was thrown out of my house by a man who told me I was worthless, that I had no place in his life anymore, that I was nothing. That same night, I found that man lying on a stretcher in my emergency room, covered in blood, after attempting to murder a woman who had discovered his crimes. And in that moment, I had to make a choice. I could follow the rules, hand over the evidence to the authorities, and hope that justice would be served. Or I could take control of the situation myself, bend those rules, and make absolutely certain that a dangerous criminal would never hurt anyone again. I chose the second path, and everything that happened after that moment flowed from that single decision. I went on to tell my story in detail, not holding anything back about my mistakes, my fears, or the gray areas where I had operated outside the law in pursuit of what I believed was justice. I talked about finding the note, about helping Lena Carter, about going directly to a federal prosecutor instead of following standard procedures. I talked about the consequences I had faced, the review boards and the job loss and the media attention. And I talked about how everything had ultimately worked out, because sometimes taking a risk is the only way to create real change. I want to be clear about something, I said, looking directly at the audience. I'm not advocating that everyone break the rules or take the law into their own hands. What I'm saying is that sometimes the systems we have in place to protect victims and to punish criminals are too slow, too bureaucratic, too easily manipulated by people with money and power. And when those systems fail, ordinary people have to step up and do extraordinary things. We have to be brave. We have to be willing to sacrifice our own safety and security for the greater good. We have to believe that justice matters more than our comfort. I spoke for 45 minutes about the intersection of domestic violence and financial crime, about how abusers often use money and economic control to keep their victims trapped and silent. I talked about the warning signs that everyone should watch for in their own relationships and in the relationships of friends and family members. I talked about resources that were available for people who wanted to escape dangerous situations. And I talked about the importance of believing victims when they come forward with stories of abuse, even when those stories seem impossible or when the abuser appears charming and successful to the outside world. When I finished my speech, the entire room rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. People were crying. People were cheering. People were rushing forward to shake my hand and to thank me for sharing my story. Lena Carter hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering, "You saved my life, Diana, and now you're saving so many others." Sarah Chen presented me with a special recognition award from the Department of Justice for my contributions to the fight against organized crime. And my husband and daughter came to the stage with a bouquet of flowers and smiles that made my heart feel like it might burst with happiness. After the symposium ended, I spent hours talking to survivors who wanted to share their own stories with me. I heard tales of courage and survival that made my own experience seem almost mundane by comparison. Women who had escaped with their children in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Women who had gathered evidence against their abusers for years before finally going to the police. Women who had rebuilt their entire lives from scratch, finding new careers and new loves and new reasons to believe in happiness. Each story reinforced my belief that human beings are capable of incredible resilience and strength when they're pushed to the edge. One woman in particular stood out to me. Her name was Jennifer, and she was in her early 20s, barely older than I had been when I first met Mark. She told me that she had been in an abusive relationship for 3 years with a man who controlled every aspect of her life, and that she had been planning to kill herself rather than continue living in that prison. But then she had seen the news story about me and Lena Carter on the anniversary of Mark's conviction, and something in our story had given her hope that escape was possible. She had called the hotline number shown on the screen, had been connected with resources, and had left her abuser 2 weeks later. She was now living in a safe house, working on getting her GED and planning to study nursing so she could help other people the way I had helped her. I hugged Jennifer and told her how proud I was of her courage, and I gave her my personal phone number with instructions to call me anytime she needed support or advice or just someone to talk to who understood what she had been through. "You're going to make it," I told her firmly. "You're going to build an amazing life for yourself, and someday you're going to help other people escape their own nightmares. The cycle of violence ends with people like you who decide to break it." As I drove home from Washington, D.C. with my family that night, I reflected on how far I had come in the decade since Mark had thrown me out of his house. I had gone from being a victim to being a survivor, to being an advocate, to being a national voice for change. I had taken my trauma and transformed it into purpose. I had taken my pain and turned it into power. And I had shown other people that they could do the same thing if they were brave enough to take that first step. My daughter Hope fell asleep in her car seat while James drove, and I turned around to look at her peaceful face illuminated by the passing streetlights.